Hello my friends, it's the Game Boy Geek here. In 2016, the game Commissioned came out, where players are early Christian apostles and must work together to mature their faith decks, grow the church, collect the books of the New Testament, and overcome persecution. Today, we'll be looking at the first expansion called The Call. It adds 2 new apostles, 2 new scenarios, 9 trials, a solo play mode, and a chain module to deepen the deck building and player interactions in the base game. Now it's on Kickstarter right now, so I'm going to show you how the expansion works, and I'll see you on the other side. This is a Kickstarter preview, so all the art and components you see here are prototype. They're not final. You're going to want to check the Kickstarter link in the description of this video to see all the final art and components. Now this expansion, The Call, has different modules, different things to add. I'm going to start with the things that you'll need to know to explain more easily all the other aspects of this expansion. Now, one of the things added here are 9 new trial cards. I have 5 of them shown here. Now, these new trial cards, they do some different things. One of them is a new mechanism called Fellowship Stop, and it's this right here. And the game comes with tokens with these as well. And these trials will have you add certain fellowship stops and things like that. There are some other things on here that we'll talk about in just a moment, but for now, just concentrate on these fellowship stops because this is a new mechanism in the game. Now, when you're creating your trial deck, you'll be using some of these cards depending on the modules you're using and the difficulty level selected. Now let's pretend we're playing the base game. If you remember, during the grow phase, if there are 3 or more population in any church, it would gain 1 just like this. However, if there was a fellowship stop token in here, after it gained 1, it would lose 1 for each of these tokens, so it would have lost us 1, essentially staying equal for that round. But let's say at the beginning of the grow phase it looked like this. There were 2 tokens. They would gain 1 because there's at least 3 population, but then they would lose 2 back to the supply. Now let's say it looked like this at the beginning of the next grow phase. They would not gain any because there's not at least 3 population, but it would still lose 2 like this, and now that church is gone, so it would be extinguished as normal, but the fellowship stop tokens would stay there. And again, 5 of the 9 new trial cards have these fellowship stop icons on it that will be putting those tokens on the board. Now you may notice that some of these cards have this chain icon on them, and that is a new module that you can add in. It makes the game a lot more difficult, but when some of these trials come up, like in this one specifically, you'd roll a die, and 1 through 4 you'd add this, and 5 through 8 you'd add a chain. So let's talk a little about chains, because again, a lot of the other things we talk about in this expansion have to do with if you're adding this chain module to it. And the other 4 cards from the trial cards in this expansion have to do with the chains, and all the new cards have this logo on them. Ones that have the chain module having to do with them has this icon on them. Now this chains module deepens both the engagement with the individual apostles' faith deck and the interaction between players. And these add these negative cards to their faith deck, for example, inconsistent, proud, and selfish. Now you get these by some of these trials, like with this trial had come out Spiritual War, each apostle would gain 1 of these and put it in their hand. Compromise, only the elder would put it in your hand, but then you'd lose 3 church members from each player's location with the chain in hand. So they're going to hurt you that way, but let's talk about what happens when you have these in your hand. Now earlier I mentioned inconsistent, proud, and selfish, and what these really represent are essentially the struggles that the apostles had with habits, biases, and issues that impacted how they communicated the good news of Jesus to people around them. And so this chains module essentially explores how these failings and the way we handle them affect the growth of the individual Christian and the effectiveness of the local church. Now there is some specific setup for this module, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but each player does start with 1 of these chains in their hand. Now you can tell other players that you have a chain, but you can't tell them anything about the chain until it's out of your hand. Now in addition to gaining 1 of these at the beginning of the game, you can also gain them from other trial cards as we showed, but also the elder will gain 1 if he rolls a 4 during the message die. Now during the pray phase, when players are playing cards face down, they will announce that they're playing a chain, just not which one. But once all those cards are there, as normal, people will flip their cards over, and any face up chain cards at this point will get resolved in the area where this apostle is. For example, this was prayed, so you lose up to 4 church members at this player's location, and for each church member you can't lose, you place 1 mission stop. So this is if it was prayed, and all of these activate, and these don't count towards the 2 cards that the elder is selecting for the round. Now, if this wasn't prayed, later on during the mature phase, when you're buying new cards, essentially you'd get -4 towards your entire sort of faith point to buy new cards. Now, once this is activated, if you've prayed it, it's gone. Like, it goes to a discard pile, where conversely, if you hold it in your hand, it's going to stay in your hand for the following round, so it will continue to give you less and less purchasing power with the faith cards if you don't get rid of them. Now, one of the possible ways to get rid of these chains is during the last phase of the round, the mature phase, when you're buying new cards. If you have no chains in your hand, you can attempt to restore another player. There's a new deck here called Restore. Now, one thing you get to do when you're restoring is you get to draw a 3-point faith card from this, either the deck or here. Now, this is a new way that the faith cards are purchased in the mature phase, and you can actually play with this in the base game or with the expansion, is that now each of the levels, 1 through 4, now have a deck and 3 cards. And now when you're in the mature phase, when you are purchasing new cards, you can choose any of the ones face up or one off the top of the deck. So in this case, when you restore, you get one of the 3, either face up or here. And also, by the way, if you want to discard one of these cards, you can spend 1 faith point to take one of these cards, put it at the bottom of the respective deck, and put a new one out there. And so it gives you a lot more decision making in the mature phase for the faith cards. Now, once that player has gotten that 3-point faith card, because they're restoring, they don't get to spend their normal faith points, they then will try to restore that player with at least 1 chain in their hand, and so they would read this. So this says, you're comfortable, but you think you're being led into something new, amazing, and scary. If you step out, it will either be the best decision you ever made or a total disaster. I ask you, what are you going to do? Will you protect your family and play it safe, or risk your comforts to step out into the future? So without saying anything else to the player, you can say, do you want to protect your family, play it safe, or risk your comforts to step out, and they have to decide. So maybe they say risk comfort to step out. Well, the player reading the card gets to pick a 2-point faith card, and the player that they're restoring gets to discard the chain and pick a 3-point faith card. But if they chose the other way, the reader would have gotten to pick a 2-point faith card, but the person we were restoring, had to keep their chain but pick a 1-point faith card. So this is a way that you could possibly help someone get rid of some of those chain cards. And now that we've learned about the Fellowship Stop and the chains, let's talk about the 2 new apostles in the game. Now, the publisher recognizes that the 2 characters are not explicitly named apostles in the New Testament, but in the interest of remaining consistent with the rest of the instructions of the base game, the 2 new characters here are going to be called apostles. And they selected those characters to recognize the important contributions of women in the early church, and because their traditional skills best align with the desired effects that they were trying to create. Now, Phoebe is one of them. It will come with a pawn that is this color here, and it comes with their own deck of cards. Now, when these cards are prayed, you can choose either to remove a Fellowship Stop or to add one to the effect that is selected from the other card in the share phase. So maybe gaining an extra church member or removing an extra stop, and so on and so forth. And historically, she's believed to have delivered Paul's epistle to the Roman Church. Now, Priscilla is the other apostle, and her cards allow her, when they're prayed, to have 2 options as well. Now, if you remember, we talked about some players having those chains that were played on some of their boards. Now, these activate first, but if one of these cards were played, the elder can select it, discard it as one of the cards, one of the 2 that they're using, to essentially nullify the effect of one of those prayed chain cards. Or, instead of that, you can select the bottom half of this. And in the last share phase, before the mature, it allows all players without a chain card in their hand to discard up to 2 cards in their hand. Then they get to select the 2 most valuable cards from their discard pile to use during the mature phase. Now, in addition to setting up the faith cards differently, meaning face up like I showed you before during the new mature phase, there's also new faith cards that are, in this expansion that you can add into the regular ones from the base game. And as you can see, a lot of them have to do with things in the expansion like the Fellowship Stops or chains. And some of them are actually specific to some of the scenarios that are added to this expansion that I'm going to go over in just a little bit. And some of them have specific effects, and I'll let you pause here and look at these cards in more detail. Now there is a solo module specifically added in here, and you get a solo board, and it works differently. Now you can play alone with its own design module. The first interesting thing is, at the beginning of the game, you actually get to choose any 6 apostle cards. You can have multiples of the same, or ones from all different apostles, but you get to sort of build your deck at the beginning of the game. Also, you set up, there's a lot of different setup things with this solo version, but I'm just going over the main things. One thing here is, everywhere that there is a member, there's a population of a church, you'll put one of these cubes here in the regions that they start in. So let's just say that these are the regions that had members. You'd start here in the furthest right, and this is where you are. This is the region that the elder staff is quote unquote in for the different trials and things like that. Now during the trial phase, this will actually show you the region that's affected, but the actual specific area that is affected is going to be where the apostle pawn is, and or any missionaries. And if there's multiples in that region, then this player gets to pick which one is affected. Now if the trial removes the last apostle or missionary from this region, this will, if it no longer has any, it will get removed. And anytime a region gets at least one member or have one population, it will get added to that region. But this will move down to the next region, and this is going to be the region that's affected by any of the cards that are prayed this round. Now during that pray phase, you're going to roll the pray die, and depending on what you roll, you'll have specific results for this solo mode. For example, this 8 would be draw the top faith card to your hand and discard the chain without negative effects. That's pretty cool. Then during the share, you would pick and apply the 2 faith cards that you selected as normal. But then in the grow phase, you'll add one member to the church of 3 or more as normal, but then you'll rotate to the next region that has at least one member. Again, anytime you're getting at least one member, it gets a cube. Anytime you lose all of them, it goes away. So it's changing the regions in the order. Once it gets here, it will move back to the next region here going this way that has an actual cube there. Now there's a lot of other little things going on here in the solo area, but this gives you a good idea of how it works. And this solo mode can be used with the base game or any parts of these expansions, including the different scenarios. Now the last area of the expansion I want to talk about are the 2 new scenarios that are included here. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Council of Jerusalem, and it uses this specific setup. In the whole game, you'll only use these areas that are filled out already. Now you'll always use the apostles of Paul and James, but then you can add other ones, and depending on how many players you're playing with, in this case we're playing with 4 players, so we have 4 apostles, and there'll be some missionaries, and they'll start in certain cities depending on which apostles are selected. Now you'll notice on the board there are these tokens. These are legalist tokens. This is new and included with this scenario and expansion. Now what you're trying to do in this scenario is get all of the apostles and the missionaries to Jerusalem, and get all 9 of the word cards under the respective spots of the New Testament. And when both of those conditions are met, the Council of Jerusalem immediately takes place. And now for the rest of the game, anywhere that an apostle is or moves to, they remove this legalist token. And the victory condition is to have no more of these legalist tokens, clearing them all, and having churches in every city in the regions that this scenario are playing with. Now, each player is going to get one of these Council of Jerusalem order of play cards. They put them on their board, but I've placed it here to show you that there are some phases that work differently, and mainly I'm going to focus on the grow phase, where depending on how many legalist tokens are on the board, you'll add a certain amount to adjacent areas. So, for example, if there's 1 to 5 tokens, you'd add 1, and so this is going to continue to spread. Also, anytime a region in play is completely surrounded by legalist tokens, in this case, this is on the edge, there's everything outside of this is outside the region of play in this scenario. So this is considered surrounded because all active areas in this scenario have a legalist token. This would get flipped over to the black side. If it later on this goes away and it's not surrounded, it will turn back to the green side. So what does this black side do? Well, in the grow phase, it essentially loses 1 church member, which means if it looked like this church would actually have been extinguished. However, if it was like this and it had the black legalist token, this would get removed during the grow phase and it would get extinguished and the legalist token would be removed. And that gives you a general sense of how the Council of Jerusalem works. It also has a card with the different special rules. The other new scenario is called Passing the Torch. Now you'll set this up depending on how many players you have. If you're playing with 1 or 2 players, you'll just be using the regions shown here. If you add a 3rd player, you'll be adding this region here. A 4th and 5th player, you'll be adding this region, and for 6 players, you're also going to add this region here. I have it set up for 2 players just to home in and show it to you a little easier. You'll start with an apostle in each of the key cities that spoke about in the setup, and you'll also have 3 members in both those areas and areas that aren't adjacent to those in the same regions. Now this is called passing the torch for the reason it's about the new leaders empowering the growth of the local church in vastly different cultural settings. So you're trying to win, to train 4 missionaries, and the regions in play need to have church in every city. Now there's a new mechanism in this scenario called division, and it has these division tokens, and they represent different things. This is a mission stop, which is essentially infighting. This is a grow stop, which is excluding others, and this is a fellowship stop, which is, situation is power hungry. Now how these divisions trigger is in the elders region. Let's say this player had the elder staff. You're going to look at a church, the largest church in this person's region, that does not have a missionary or apostle there. In this case, it's at Damascus. And you take one of these division tokens from the supply, and once they are actually randomized, one side has the division and the other side is sort of blank, so you can't tell which one you're drawing. In this case, we have a growth stop. And these divisions trigger after the trial, but before the pray action. Now, if it was tied for the churches that have the most in that region, then it would go to the one that's closer to Jerusalem. But if all churches in that elders region have either an apostle and or a missionary, then no division happens. Now, how do you defeat these divisions? Let's assume this was placed here when there was no apostle or missionary there, but then you end up getting a missionary or apostle there. Now, if there's a prayed card, that's a word card, for the elders select as one of the 2 cards, they discard this card without using either the board effect or collecting the New Testament. It just gets discarded. Then the message die will get rolled by the apostle in this area, but in this case there isn't one, so it's essentially the elder in that area. For that missionary will roll the die, and if this number is equal to or higher than the number of members in that church, then it's defeated. And then that player will place that token on their board. But if the roll was less than the amount there, then you would lose 2 church members to the division. Now you can try again using the same share action, assuming you have another word card to discard and that the previous action was your first share action card for that turn. Another way is for the elder to select one of these special cards from the expansion that allows you to get rid of a division that has a church with an apostle or missionary there. But when using this effect, you don't roll the die but don't collect the token either. So how do you train up these missionaries? Well, you have to have an elder that has one of those division tokens from earlier, from defeating a division, and then you'll have a church member alongside you where you're at. You'd also have to have 2 prayed word cards that go under the board, and there couldn't have already been these books already, and it has to be 2 of them in that same round. And essentially you would take one of those church members and replace it with a missionary. But that elder would have needed to remove one of those previously acquired division tokens from their board in order to do this. So that's pretty much how this scenario works at a high level. Again, you're trying to train 4 missionaries and have the regions in play have churches in every city. It does come with a specific order of play for this scenario and some special rules that you can look at on the card. Well, there you have Commissioned the Call. And as I showed in the overview, it brings things you can add to the standard base game, but it also adds modules and ways to play that are new. Now, if you'd like to see the final art and components and all the different pledge levels available, you can click the link below me in the description of this video, and it will take you directly to the Kickstarter project page, and I'm sure that Kara Games would love your support.